Well, see, that's the thing. I mean, if we stayed where we were in, say, 1960 when we were doing Love Me Do, and then Please Please Me, and From Me to You, which was one kind of thing, you know, it was a kind of thing people liked. The thing is, if we did that now, I think our fans, the kind of fans that we got now, wouldn't like that too much, because it'd be going back and it'd be retracing your steps, you know. And also, from our point of view, we're never going to do that, because I mean, if we ever have to do that, if anyone suddenly says you're going too way out and you've got to get back to then, well, we'll give up, you know.
With the previous album, Rubber Soul, the Beatles knew the direction they were heading in, but no one could have imagined the leaps and bounds that they would take on Revolver. The audio segment I just played you pretty much showed the attitude of the Beatles with the release of Revolver. The album's release was massively overshadowed though by all the controversy they were going through at the time. Obviously, many people know about the more popular than Jesus remarks, which caused the US Bible Belt to basically heckle the Beatles, even going so far as to burn their records publicly at Beatle bonfires. That alone would have been enough, but combine that with some of their incidents such as the unintentional snubbing of the First Lady at the Philippines, the playing at the Budokan in Japan, and the controversial Yesterday and Today album cover, which their own record label even refused to put out. But combining with all that, the Beatles in 1966 just seemed to be running into controversy everywhere they looked. However, at the same time, they ended up having one of their most creative periods in their history as a result. The first 3 months of 1966 were actually completely off for them as a result of not committing to a film. This 3-month gap eventually paved way for an onslaught of artistic inspiration which would impact Paul, John, George, and Ringo during the sessions for their new album Revolver. Several factors played a role in why this album was just so different from their previous efforts. For starters, the staff the Beatles worked with at the time had a new member in Geoff Emerick, who was now the engineer working in the booth alongside George Martin. Now, many not too familiar with the Beatles probably don't know about Geoff Emerick, but this guy played a highly large role in changing the Beatles' sound. Many of the sonic experimentation on this album actually comes from Geoff Emerick himself. Most of the time when the Beatles wanted a specific sound, they weren't really musically trained, so they always had to tell George Martin what sound they were kind of thinking of, and they described it to him in a peculiar manner. For example, on the track Tomorrow Never Knows, Lennon wanted his voice to sound like Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop. As you can imagine, being on the production team for the Beatles was not all fun and games. As I mentioned though, Geoff Emerick was largely responsible now for converting the Beatles' ideas into actual sounds, and this album would really mark the debut of that. Another thing this album would mark the debut of was the psychedelic craze by the Beatles. I mean, you can kind of tell just by looking at this incredibly psychedelic album cover. This cover is personally my favorite album cover of all time, just because of how much content is on it. Tons of pictures were taken and then mashed together with a collage that was drawn by a friend of the Beatles in their Hamburg days, Klaus Wurman. He was one of those unknown people, like Geoff Emerick, who actually helped out the Beatles not only during their tenure together, but during their future solo records. For this album cover though, he ended up winning a Grammy for this album cover, and rightfully so, because I think it's a really sensational cover. Going back to the psychedelic craze though, while Rubber Soul had some early psychedelic effects on some of its tracks such as Norwegian Wood, The Word, and Nowhere Man, Revolver basically had full force into psychedelic rock. This was a genre that had recently been sparked by bands such as the 13th Floor Elevators and the Beach Boys, who both released albums that were heavily influential in the creation of psychedelic rock. Revolver would mark another step forward in the progression of this genre, as a couple songs on this album, notably Paul McCartney's, were actually inspired by Pet Sounds. Most importantly though, the drug references on Full Throttle. Despite Paul McCartney's refusal to try LSD, the other 3 members actually used their experience with it to write more intellectually stimulating and experimental songs. The days of She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand were now long gone in the studio. Live? Well, none of the tracks on Revolver were ever performed live by the Beatles because of how complex their arrangements were. But now that I've talked about all this though, let's really get into the album and look at every single track to just fully realize how groundbreaking and influential this album really is. Folks, it's time to sit back in our chairs and not lose our egos. This is Revolver.
Cause I'm the Taxman.
So we start off with, wow, a George Harrison song? I'm quite shocked personally. This is the first non-Lennon or McCartney song to start a Beatles album, and spoiler alert, it will be the only Beatles UK album to start with a George Harrison song. Now you might be asking, well, why did they choose this album in particular to do so? The opening of the song actually answers that question pretty quickly, as we get a 1, 2, 3, 4 count in
1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2.
Pretty reminiscent of the very first Beatles album opener. Remember that? The best part is that the count-in we all hear is actually wrong, and we actually hear the barely audible correct count-in from the background. That's honestly a really cool way to start an album, and the fact that I've been talking this long about the first 6 seconds of a track is definitely a good sign for this song. I mentioned in the intro that this was a psychedelic album, and sure enough, this song really exemplifies all the qualities of a psychedelic rock song. I mean, the guitars in this song are really thick and incredibly piercing, honestly. That riff in the background especially is just so sharp and goes along perfectly alongside George's witty vocals. I know what you might be thinking of though. Didn't I criticize She's a Woman for having a repeating guitar riff that never lets up, while in this track, nearly the same thing happens? Well, here it's a tad bit different because each verse actually changes it up, and the sequence it's playing specifically changes to accommodate the structure of the track. When the background vocals come in around the last couple of verses, the repeating guitar riff does change to incorporate more of a hammer-on-like phrase. The truly defining moment of this song, though, comes in the guitar solo, because there's never been really such a harsh guitar solo before in a Beatles song. The closest guitar solo in harshness I'd say that probably came close was the solo in You Can't Do That. Even then, though, the solo in that song was kind of a bit more simplistic, while in this song, the guitar solo was so tricky that George Harrison actually had to let Paul McCartney do it, and man did he knock it out of the park. In fact, most of the guitar work in the song actually comes from Paul himself, as he plays both the lead and rhythm guitars. As much as this is a George Harrison song in terms of the original concept and title, ironically, it has more of an influence from Paul and John musically. John Lennon later admitted, in fact, in helping George Harrison with some of the lyrics, so there's really more of a group dynamic in the song overall. The lyrics, by the way, just mark yet another step of development for the Beatles, as they venture past their basic love songs from Pre-Rubber Soul. Now, if you haven't guessed it yet, by the duration of how long I've been talking about this song, it's certainly good. I mean, just about everything clicks in the song, from the amazing harmonies popping up after the solo, to the guitar solo itself for that matter. Comparing this album opener to previous Beatles albums, it's just vastly different, and it's really something no Beatles fan could have seen coming when they first heard it. That's going to be a theme alert throughout this album, just letting you know.
All the lonely people, where do they all come from? All the lonely people, where do they all belong?
And the second track is the incredibly famous Beatles song, Eleanor Rigby. Similar to the last song, although it's mostly a Paul McCartney song, it's got contributions from pretty much everyone, including one of John Lennon's close friends, Pete Shotton. Now, while this song isn't psychedelic, it's really a kind of song unheard of in the pop music scene. The Beatles in their Pet Sounds album had a pretty similar song lyrically, but in this case, it's not only the lyrics that are incredibly poetic and far out, but also the music itself. I actually took a popular music history class in my second college semester, and when we got to the Beatles, this song was actually brought up as one of those influential Beatles tracks because, surprisingly, it's one of the few instances of the strings from the orchestra actually driving the rhythm. This is mainly because there aren't really any guitars or drums on the track, so we're talking about a pop song that has none of the popular music instruments, not even a piano, which is really, like I said, unheard of at the time. The inspiration for the style of orchestra for George Martin was actually the Psycho soundtrack, and you can definitely see it a little bit. Going back to the lyrics though, it's yet another massive leap up the scale for Paul McCartney. On Rubber Soul, he did write a lot of mature love songs, but in this case, he's now writing non-love songs, and his first one on an album ends up being one hell of a song. I mean, I just really love how the lyrics tell a story in only 2 minutes. More importantly, it builds character depth and really ends incredibly sadly too, creating a ton of emotion. Now, Bob Dylan obviously had been doing that with his songs, but we're seeing it done in a pop song, which is just brilliant. One of my favorite parts of this song are actually the harmonies with the "Ah, look at all the lonely people."
Ah, look at all the lonely people. Ah, look at all the lonely people.
With the lyrics corresponding perfectly to the unconventional music, I honestly couldn't imagine another way they could have recorded this song while keeping the imagery and tone here. With this song released as a single, it served as a sign that the Beatles' music was going to continue to take leaps and bounds and improve drastically. It's also interesting just how different this song sounds from Taxman. Not many Beatles albums before this have really had consecutive tracks that sound completely different, but after Rubber Soul, it's about to be a regular occurrence. Anyways, this one is not only good, it's one of the greatest Beatles songs, and really one of the greatest songs of all time for that matter. I mean, seriously, play She Loves You and then this song back to back, and then you'll just be blown away at the progression of this group. Speaking of progression, we get John Lennon's first song on the album, I'm Only Sleeping. Now this song is the first song on the album to actually be completely solo written, and it's actually another personality driven song. John Lennon liked writing songs about himself, and after doing so in Rubber Soul, he continues here with this track. Now for starters, we get another song that sounds completely different from the track before it. I mean, Taxman was on the heavy side, Eleanor Rigby was mostly orchestra, and this song is pretty folk sounding. Most of the instrumentation here is acoustic, but we do get a lot of electric guitar effects that are actually reversed throughout the song. In fact, the guitar solo itself is backwards. It was actually written to be backwards, and George Harrison spent hours in the studio trying to perfect it, which really just goes to show how much effort the Beatles gave in general to each of their songs. They could have easily just written a simple solo and then reversed it, but they went all out here. As a result, the song's quality greatly increases. What's most amazing about this track specifically is that there really isn't too great of a melody on its own. If it weren't for all the varuspeeding, backmasking, and overdubbing on this track, it could have easily been a forgettable song, but it's really a great example of using the studio as an instrument on its own. A lot of the elements in this song are actually a direct result of the studio experimentation. For starters, John Lennon's voice is pretty high-pitched in the song, but that's because of a technique they used that I mentioned called varuspeeding. Basically, when John went down to record his vocals, they had the tape running at a slower speed, so when it got played back, the tape was actually sped up, and John's voice, as a result, sounded higher. Think of it like raising your pitch on an editing program, but back in the 1960s with tape machines, they had to use techniques like this to achieve the desired effect. This song, as a result, is quite technically complex, and similar to all the songs on this album, none were performed live as a result of that. The biggest impact with this song, though, is the timbre and tone of the track perfectly match the lyrics. When you think of a dream song such as All I Have to Do Is Dream, the only way they achieved a dreamlike tone in that song was by using complex harmonies because they didn't have the technology really to pull off something more suitable. In this song though, whether it's the backwards guitars, the higher pitched vocals, or the thickness of the acoustic guitars, really every sound in the song really represents what the message is all about, which according to John Lennon is dreaming your life away. Aside from the lack of good melody, there's really nothing bad about this song, and that's what easily makes it good. It not only uses the studio to its advantage, but it takes off at the concept. One last thing to note though, regarding those backwards effects that I mentioned, apparently, according to John Lennon, he said it's the first time anyone has ever used backwards sound effects on a record. And to his dying day, I'm sure he was pretty proud of that. This is our second George Harrison song already. I mean, that's quite insane that we've already had 2 George Harrison songs within the first 4 tracks. As I said, that's never going to happen again on a Beatles album, but it must have been great for George Harrison that his songs were finally getting accepted. Anyways, holy crap is this song quite legendary. In Region Wood, we heard the Indian instrument sitar be used as the melody of the song alongside the acoustic guitar work. If you thought the Beatles were done there, Oh boy, you couldn't be more wrong. Rubber Soul changed George Harrison musically, as he'd now really begun his Indian craze that would last the rest of his life. He actually took up sitar lessons from legendary sitar player Ravi Shankar, and I guess he decided to write a song around what he'd learned, and man, oh man, he went quite far out with that. The first 10 seconds of the song itself probably baffled every Beatles fan with just how out of tradition it sounded. The song itself, in fact, isn't even a pop song by any stretch of the imagination. It's an Indian classical song written to really fit that mold. As an Indian myself, I'm quite familiar with the way Indian classical music works, and I have to say, it comes really close to a lot of songs from that genre. I mean, this song mimics that genre so perfectly, from the sitar introduction I mentioned, to the change of speed at the end, to even the vocal style of George Harrison on this track. I mean, this kind of song really highlights how versatile this group is. Any other band might have completely lost their audience's appeal if they did a song like this, but as Paul McCartney said in that voice clip I showed you, they were taking it one step at a time, and this song pretty much solidifies that. They took another massive step forward. Fortunately for fans back then, the lyrics do get back to a love song, but it does actually incorporate some philosophy into it by mentioning how time is limited in loving someone. The fact that George Harrison wrote You Like Me Too Much just 1 year ago is just amazing considering the progression he's made. I'll talk more about that in the end, but George's mind has definitely changed a ton since discovering the sitar. Anyways, this song is definitely good. Now, it's a bit hard to judge for some people because of how Eastern it is, but when you examine the quality of the track objectively, it's really amazing how George managed to pull this off. Not only did he manage to create an authentic tribute to Indian classical music, but he really managed to go beyond the traditions of a pop song to do so. Not even Dylan did that, which amazes me. Don't count out George Harrison as a writer, folks.
Here, making each day of the year, changing my life with a wave of her hand.
Next up is Here, There, and Everywhere, a song that may have very well been written by an angel. Just kidding, it's actually written by Paul McCartney. After 4 tracks of complex non-love songs, we finally get a love song by Paul McCartney, who's actually going to be the only guy on this album that consistently writes love songs. Now, if you thought Paul McCartney's songs on Rubber Soul are mature, oh man, this song takes it up a million notches from that and manages to take you to another place. I've talked about how great the harmonies have been for about 6 albums now, but when I say this next statement, I'm dead serious. This song has the greatest harmonies of any Beatles song. You can give me This Boy, you can give me Yes It Is, Nowhere Man, I'll Be Back, and so on, but no song to me compares to this one. For starters, they complement Paul McCartney's delicate vocals perfectly. They actually managed to create a lot of imagery in this song, and whenever I listen to this song, I literally get put into a trance because of how complex those harmonies are. According to George Martin, the harmonies took a ton of hours to execute perfectly, and I think that all those hours were really worth it based on the end result. The inspiration for this song, believe it or not, was the legendary song God Only Knows by the Beach Boys, which Paul McCartney states as his favorite song of all time. Now, if you've seen my posts on DeviantArt, I've gone on a lot about how God Only Knows is really fantastic. Personally, this song may not come that close to beating that song quality-wise, but as a Beatles song, this one is definitely an all-time classic. Lyrically, what makes the song so distinctive is the realization of the moment, and just the poetic imagery we get. That best line quote I put up alone pretty much represents the quality of the lines we get in this song. I mean, the phrase changing my life with the wave of her hand is probably my favorite line by Paul McCartney on this album, to be quite honest. So we have all-time legendary harmonies, incredible lyrics, and now the instrumentation. I've heard some complaints about the guitar work in the background kind of being a detriment to the song, but I think it's actually a perfect fit because of how the song flows. It follows the key of the lead vocals and kind of just flows along before going into a trumpet-esque sounding outro. Honestly guys, this is the kind of song that leaves you speechless from the amount of quality it has. When even John Lennon, who's criticized songs such as I Feel Fine and 8 Days a Week, comes on and says that this song is his favorite of the Beatles, then you know you've succeeded. I mean, without hesitation, I can definitely call this the highlight of the side so far, and quite easily a good song. Probably one of the greatest songs of all time, honestly.
We We all live in a yellow submarine. Yellow submarine. Yellow submarine.
Ah, we arrive at yet another well-known Beatles track, Yellow Submarine. Pretty much the iconic song of all our childhoods. I mean, as an adult, it's easy to look at this song and call it quite ridiculous, but I actually think it's a bit more than that, honestly. I mentioned how Yellow Submarine is essentially the prime example of using the studio as an instrument, but this song definitely uses the studio as an instrument itself. I mean, this song has a ton of effects which really enhances its quality. The song is well known as being one of the most simplistic Beatles songs out there, but with all the effects added to it, the song really comes to life. I mean, you get water gurgling sounds, a ship sound effects, and even a segment in the song where John Lennon takes the role of some sailors on the ship. The best part has to be the chorus, which has a giant harmony backing to it, made up of a bunch of people, not just the Beatles themselves, such as Brian Epstein, Mick Jagger, George Harrison's wife Pattie Boyd, and a ton of others just contributing vocals to it. It's really a giant sing-along song of sorts, as a result, I can imagine this really being a fun song to sing with the group. Back to looking at it critically though, it's a children's song in genre, and I have to say that it's really amazingly pulled off. I mean, not only are the lyrics fun for children, but they're also fun for adults, with references to the real world thrown in potentially. Now, while I completely believe it's a nonsense song, I don't quite believe that they didn't try to throw in a couple of lines in reflecting their feelings at the time. But now the last thing to mention is Ringo Starr, who continues the tradition of getting one lead vocal on every Beatles album. As a result, the simplicity of the track definitely makes more sense since he's singing it. So with this track being fun and entertaining, how can you not love it? It's definitely a good song, and while it's quite childish in nature, it has a ton of stuff that really makes it a heck of an enjoyable addition to the album.
And she's making me feel like I've never been born.
To close out side 1, we get a hell of an acid trip and She Said, She Said. This is the kind of song you couldn't even imagine the Beatles doing in any shape or fashion a year prior to this album. I mean, my god, this song is quite possibly the closest thing to an acid trip as it gets. I say that knowing what's to come, by the way. Let me just start off by saying that this song was so acidy that Paul McCartney didn't even participate in it. Actually, the truth is that Paul McCartney just had a verbal fight or something before the sessions for this song with John, and he just stormed out, which happened to be the last sessions for that album. Honestly, a song like this is so trippy that I can't even imagine a guy like Paul McCartney's really supporting it. Now that's the reason why he called it very much John in his biography after all. Anyways, let's get to what is definitely my favorite song of all time. I mean, where do I even start? First off, the song was inspired by an incident with Peter Fonda, who was a famous actor and counterculture figure. There was a massive party that the Beatles had in their mansion during their US tour, and all the guests, except for Paul McCartney and a few others, took acid. Apparently George was starting to have a bad trip, and Peter walked up to him and tried to comfort him by saying that he knows what it's like to be dead and how there's nothing to be afraid of. But he said this around John Lennon, and when John heard that, he got pissed and said, "You're making me feel like I've never been born." With those 2 lines, a song was born. However, 2 lines like that really only scrape the surface of this interesting topic, and they really only make up the verses of this song. Sure enough, John experimented around and then came up with the middle 8 with the help of George Harrison, with the lines, "When I was a boy, everything was right."
She said, "You don't understand what I said." I said, "No, no, no, you're wrong. When I was a boy, everything was right."
It took only 2 lines, but that adds a massive amount of depth to the song, turning it from a simple psychedelic track into a pretty nostalgic acidy song. So lyrically, this is as far out as John Lennon has been, and I'd honestly describe the song as a more psychedelic version of In My Life, going off lyrics alone. Musically, oh boy, this is where the song really elevates itself. For starters, the song is essentially a conglomeration of 3 separate guitar parts. One part is basically the rhythm, which is pretty complex actually, consisting of variations of the A7 chord. The other is responsible for all the guitar licks you hear in the song, as well as the heavy thickness throughout the song. The last guitar is actually George, who's on bass, playing an actually more simplistic pattern, mainly because Paul McCartney walked out. Needless to say, the guitars all merge well together to create quite an amazing psychedelic atmosphere. Then we get to the drumming, which is easily one of the greatest drumming performances I've ever heard. I mean, Ringo Starr goes completely ballistic on this track, really showcasing some of his finest drum fills and techniques throughout the verses. One of my favorite moments are the cymbal crashes that coincide with the guitar work at the end of the verses. It doesn't end there either. Going back to the middle 8, I really love how the song changes from 4x4 to 3x4 on the When I Was a Boy segment. By changing time signatures, the song actually becomes more poignant because there's more of an emphasis on that line. Speaking of the lines, by the way, I'd personally rank this as one of John's greatest vocal performances because really of the power and nostalgic feel to the lines. The melody in this one is also insane with the drum melody, guitar melody, and vocal melodies all really being strong. It's so powerful that this song has been stuck in my head non-stop since October of 2015. It's been nearly 2 years and I'm still obsessed with this track, which is why it's my favorite song of all time, really. It's also easily a good song. The drum performance is legendary, changing time signatures and ending the track at a quickened pace. The guitar work is sensational, being an amazing mashup of 3 different parts, and the vocals are among my favorite Lennon performances. Simply put, guys, I love this song to death. I've heard it over 400 times and I don't think I'll ever get sick of it. It's quite easily the most obsessive I get over any song. On its own though, it quite possibly defines the change of the Beatles, being that it was the last song recorded on this album.
Good day, sunshine. Good day, sunshine. Good day, sunshine.
After the amount of psychedelic tension from the side 1 closer, it's only fitting that we get perhaps the cleanest song on the album in Good Day Sunshine, written by Paul McCartney. Now people might go ahead and call this the filler song of the album, but I actually don't view it as filler at all because it does do some things differently from the other tracks. Aside from being the most clean track in terms of the texture being rather thin, the song is actually quite vaudeville styled. The piano work alone pretty much puts it into that category on its own, but even aside from that, the lyrics are pretty much back to the style of Pre-Rubber Soul, in terms of being a rather simple love song. For an album like this though, I think you need tracks like this that kind of settle down the mood temporarily because side 1 was pretty heavy on its lyrical content when you think about it. A track like this is definitely a more relaxing song while still maintaining some great sound from side 1. The harmonies are fantastic and the piano playing is really a nice addition to the calm and soothing vocals. Now similar to Another Girl from Help, this one really benefits from being inconsequential because it takes off with that title musically. The best word to describe this song would actually be effortless because as a whole, this is really a prime example of the Beatles enjoying themselves when taking a song for what it is. Another word to describe it is good. If this song was on any other album, it definitely might have stood out more honestly, but because it's on Revolver, it does get overshadowed, but the track definitely shines brighter than the sun, if you know what I mean.
Tell me that you've got everything you want, and your bird can sing, but you don't get me. You don't get me.
After a break with the last track, we head back into psychedelic territory with And Your Bird Can Sing, written by John Lennon. Now this song is pretty much a more upbeat and softer version of She Said when musically. Similar to that track, we have 3 guitar parts, each doing a different task. One plays the chords, one plays the melody, and the other is obviously the bass guitar, which is Paul McCartney this time. What I really love though about this one in particular is the solo itself. I think the fact that it's upbeat and good-natured really makes this one rock a bit harder. This is actually a song that Lennon has panned, which I don't get at all because I really feel this is a good song. The guitar work here, as I mentioned, is back to the standards from side 1, with a lot of fantastic passages appearing in the introduction and the outro. The vocals are really solid and upbeat, and the lyrics are quite clever at times. An earlier version of this song actually had Lennon and McCartney laughing because of how fun they were having with this song. And personally, I'd call it the most fun song on this album. There isn't a whole lot to go over on face value because this is probably the most upfront song on this album aside from the previous track, but it definitely is yet another strong track on this album, and easily among their best songs as a whole if you really appreciate the guitar work here.
And in her eyes you see nothing, no sign of love behind the tears cried for no one, a love that should have lasted years.
Next up is For No One by Paul McCartney, which is essentially the sequel to Yesterday from a stylistic perspective. On Rubber Soul, Paul McCartney was writing quite a lot of breakup songs such as I'm Looking Through You and You Won't See Me, but this song takes it up a notch and really goes above and beyond in terms of the tone. What deserves the most praise here is the vocal performance of Paul McCartney because, my god, the tone in his voice in this song is absolutely devastating. Just the way the song starts itself is absolutely spine-chilling. It doesn't have an introduction or anything, Paul just goes straight into it.
Your day breaks, your mind aches, you find that all her words of kindness linger on when she no longer needs you.
The words he's singing, in fact, are really amazing. The first line of the song itself is, quite honestly, one of the greatest opening lines I've ever heard. I mean, what a way to start a song. With the tone of Paul's voice being absolutely devastating and the lyrics being quite possibly some of the finest lyrics of any breakup song, it's only natural that musical accompaniment is just as fantastic. It's mostly a song done on piano, or in this case a clavichord, but it then incorporates a French horn solo that is extremely perfect fit to quite an emotional upheaval of a song. That French horn solo is quite famous for incorporating the highest range of the instrument. Honestly, this song is yet another classic from this album. It's sadly a more forgotten song because of its placement on being in the middle of side 2, but folks, I think this is a tune that quite possibly matches the tonality of Yesterday. Lyrically, I actually prefer this song because of just how straight up the words are. The worst part of a breakup is realizing that the other person no longer needs you in any way, and it's conveyed so incredibly well in this song. This is quite possibly one of the greatest breakup songs of all time.
You're a new and better man, he helps you to understand, he does everything he can, Dr. Robert.
We head right back into psychedelia with Dr. Robert, making it 2 John Lennon and Paul McCartney collaborations. This song is another song that's regarded as filler, and similar to my response to Good Day Sunshine being regarded as filler, I think this song is unfairly called filler. For starters, it's one hell of a psychedelic song with the incorporation of the harmonium. Yup, that instrument from The Word returns here and makes an absolutely sensational appearance during the bridge of the song, which is quite possibly the greatest section of any song on this album.
Well, you're feeling fine. We'll make you.
For starters, the drums just disappear and then the harmonies amp it up to psychedelic levels, along with that rising harmonium in the background. The first time I heard this song, I was absolutely blown away from that section, and it was personally this song that actually made me check out the rest of the album. As for the verses, they're definitely on par with the verses of a song like Day Tripper, in terms of being more of a rocker. The lyrical content is definitely cliched at this point, but there are a ton of clever moments in this track, such as the lyrical highlight I put up. As a whole though, this song really takes Andrew Bird Can Sing's upbeat music, and then takes off with the concept, making it even more psychedelic, with the addition of the middle 8. I think it's absolutely a good song, and really a neat hidden gem on this album. It was actually my favorite song on this album before I got obsessed with She Said, She Said.
I want to tell you, my head is filled with things to say.
The psychedelic rampage continues with our last George Harrison song on this album, I Want to Tell You. So this one is pretty interesting compared to the previous 2 songs. Taxman was snarky, Love You Too was philosophical, and I think this song is more of a personality issue. It's actually a message that's incredibly relatable to any shy person. Ever get that feeling where you know you have a lot to say about something, and then when you actually arrive to the moment, you suddenly lose all those thoughts and only manage to come up with maybe half of your original thoughts on the spot? Well, this song was made for those moments. In terms of the music here, it's like a combination of psychedelic guitar work and piano work. Amazingly, it works to perfection here because the piano and guitar both make the song quite disorienting, which make it very easy for you to trance through the song. Personally, I just get so into this song that I end up forgetting where I am until the last verse. Then we get to the vocals, which are really amazingly done, with George Harrison conveying the frustration in his voice really well alongside Paul McCartney's really fantastic background vocals. In the fade out of the track, Paul McCartney's voice actually goes insane. Reminds me of a technique used in Indian music where the singer glides up and down frantically, known as a melisma. I think this song really is a combination of Eastern and Western techniques into one, and what you get is a really remarkable song that really captures George Harrison's growth perfectly on this album. It's easily a good song, and whether it's the dissonance of the melody or the Eastern influences, this is a track that really demonstrates the versatility of the album.
Want you to hear me say we'll be together every day. Got to get you into my life.
The penultimate track on this album is Got to Get You Into My Life by Paul McCartney. Now, a song like this really feels like the finale because of how absolutely powerful it is. The jazz-like power of the brass section on this track is brilliant. The melody from this track as a result is absolutely sensational. I honestly call it the best melody on this album personally because it immediately grabs you within the first 5 seconds and then just takes off. Another thing that really grabs you is Paul McCartney's vocals. This album has essentially been Paul McCartney's way to show you that he doesn't need drugs to show the power of his writing. In this case, he's writing what's essentially an ode to pot as he describes it, but he writes it in such a way where you can actually interpret it as a love song as well. Vocal-wise though, Paul McCartney just destroys some of the lines in the song, especially the ending where he glides higher and higher until the track fades out.
I took a ride, I didn't know what I would find there. Another road where maybe I could see another kind of mind there. And suddenly I see you.
Music-wise, aside from the brilliance of the brass section, the track actually does contain guitar work that makes quite an appearance near the ending of the track, which is basically the psychedelic portion of the song. As a whole, it's not really a psychedelic song, but it does contain elements of that genre, with thickness being one of them. That means all of Paul McCartney's songs on this album were not psychedelic, which is pretty amazing actually considering the influence of John and George. Anyways, this song is easily a great song. Not only is the melody here an all-time great, but the overall elements in the song really work together well. It stylistically merges jazz and psychedelia, and the end result is absolutely sensational. This could have been the album closer, but instead, we get one more track. Oh boy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows. It's pretty much recognized as the most far-out leap into the future that Beatles song for a bevy of reasons. For starters, this song is quite literally a product of the studio. It uses so many studio techniques that talking about this song might take a while. Now to begin with, John's voice is double-tracked in the first 3 verses, which is pretty normal, but then after the solo section, his voice sounds like it comes from another dimension. What actually happens is that his microphone is hooked up to a Leslie speaker, which is a device that generally is used as a loudspeaker for a Hammond organ. Yeah, they decided to put vocals through that, and the end result ends up making an incredibly trippy song even trippier. What also makes this song trippy are those tape loops, which are basically small snippets of sound that were modified by either reversing, speeding up, or slowing it down, and then looped. The end result was basically a mashup of various sounds that Paul McCartney recorded, which were then added on top of the track. Similar to Yellow Submarine sound effects, these tape loops are actually pretty vital to the song. And removing them basically creates a monotonous sounding track. After all, the drum beat in the song never changes, and neither do the guitar chords, which are only a C being repeated over and over again. Other things they did here were adding a tempura, which is another Indian instrument, a sitar, a backwards guitar solo which actually predated I'm Only Sleeping's backwards solo, since this song was actually the very first song recorded for the album. A song like this basically exemplifies what this album was about, which was experimentation and having fun, honestly. There's also the lyrics, which are a combination of philosophy and things said when you're tripping. I mean, my favorite line is the one I put up, which is a pretty nice piece of advice, actually. As a whole, though, this song is really the biggest leap into the future any band at the time ever took. It marked a new step in the world of pop music for that matter. It was really now about pushing the boundaries of music as far as you could get instead of just trying to appeal to the mass public. To get to a point though that I'll make in a few minutes, the Beatles really just got bored of traditional music and looked for more unusual sounds and so on. That's why this track really ended up being as otherworldly as it ended up. Bottom line though, this song is definitely good. It's not traditional at all, and if you showed any person a song like this today, they might just disregard it altogether. But the importance of this song, and album for that matter, on popular music just cannot be denied whether you liked the songs or not.
Paperback writer, paperback writer, paperback writer.
We aren't done yet, as we got the Paperback Writer single. Now this one is actually Paul McCartney's first song not about love, as it was released before Eleanor Rigby. It's also the first psychedelic Paul McCartney song with actually a lot of elements from that genre being into play here. For starters, the vocals are pretty insane, and the harmonies especially are really top notch. The psychedelic aspect is that echo effect they use at the transition from the verse to the chorus, which is really cool actually. What's even cooler are those high-pitched background vocals accompanying McCartney. What we all know and love about this song though is that guitar riff, which is a riff that's easily among the best Beatles guitar riffs out there. The guitar brick itself is really thick in texture, which is the other element of psychedelic rock that's used here. Interestingly, John Lennon described the song as the son of Day Tripper as a result of its structure, and I can definitely agree with him on that, and say for certainty that this is a good song. Not only is the vocal performance top notch with the impact of the harmonies, but the guitar brick is really exceptional, and the lyrics even serve as a distinction of telling a story similar to Eleanor Rigby. This one was really the beginning of Paul McCartney's venture into the realms of psychedelic music, and apart from that, it's just a fantastic rock song. Last song to talk about here is Rain, which was the B-side to Paperback Writer. Now while Paperback Writer had elements of psychedelia, this song is flat out psychedelic, with the amazingly thick texture, the acidy melody, and the heavily distorted guitar work. The biggest star in this song though is, well, Ringo Starr himself. The drumming performance in the song really rivals She Said, as one of the greatest drumming performances I've ever heard. The fills and intensity of his drumming here is really amongst one of his finest moments for the Beatles. It's also helped greatly by Paul McCartney's bass work, which is really phenomenal, and combined with Ringo Starr's performance, the musicianship is really at a legendary level here. The lyrics also dive into the psychedelic territory, making a couple of interesting references, and the topic of rain itself is apparently a part of the drug phenomenon itself. The biggest impact of this song though is that it's the first released Beatles song to have backwards vocals in it. It was released before I'm Only Sleeping and Tomorrow Never Knows, and the backwards effect on this track only signaled for what was to come on those songs to the general audience. This song, quite honestly, is underrated because it's one of the best Beatles songs. It's easily good. Not only does the song exceed its B-side status, but it really excelled musically and has such an amazing psychedelic melody. This is really one of the defining singles though for the Beatles, because similar to Tomorrow Never Knows, it signaled the end of an era dominated by screaming fans and mop tops, and the beginning of an era that many popular music historians cite as the peak of the Beatles' creative period. With this song, it not only showcased what was to come on Revolver, but what was to come in general for popular music as psychedelic rock would explode the following year. And that is every track of Revolver and the accompanying single reviewed. For the first time on this video review series, we have a perfect album from a rating perspective. The biggest reason for this really being the absence of any filler tracks or songs that are just there to, fill an album. Every track on this album was distinctive and it served its own purpose one way or another. Every track on this album also felt really compelling as well, and that's why this album really stands out to me as being particularly an all-time great album. I mean, there are a ton of tracks here that stand out as all-time great, and when I reveal my song rankings, just know that it was incredibly difficult to do. This album though was so incredibly consistent with all its tracks' quality that ranking all the tracks was close to impossible. But heading into the album rankings now, you can see that Revolver has taken over a top spot, making it the third album in a row to do so in the same video I review it. The song rankings, as I mentioned, are going to be very difficult when doing Revolver, but I feel comfortable in saying that every track I talked about in this video is definitely better than most of the Beatles songs I've talked about so far. So going down the list, you might not really see any Revolver track for quite a while. I mean, as great as their old material is, most of it really doesn't compare to the greatness of the tracks on this album. Anyways, the best track, as you can see, is Tomorrow Never Knows, but notice how no song from Revolver manages to topple In My Life as the best Beatles song. And that's because the depth and quality of In My Life was just a bit too good for the songs on this album to match specifically. However, after that, it's a ton of Revolver, as you can see. I mean, that's just simply how good this album was, honestly. To conclude the video though, let's now go over the 3 observations I made during this album. The first one is the beginning of the Beatles' psychedelic period. Now, it's hard to believe that this phase only lasted 3 albums, but Revolver is really the start of it, and it's only going to increase from here on out. Of the 16 tracks I reviewed on this album, 9 of them were psychedelic, and 3 others had psychedelic influences in them, so this album was largely dominated by the impact of psychedelia on the Beatles. The reasoning for this was similar to what I mentioned in the intro, which was it was simply the landscape of the pop music industry at the time, as well as the thirst the Beatles had for more unconventional sounds. John Lennon especially was really the ringleader of this phase, with all the songs he wrote by himself being psychedelic, except Yellow Submarine, which he co-wrote. Now, many people call Sgt. Pepper the first psychedelic album, but Revolver definitely started it. I mean, John Lennon even admits it in one of the quotes he stated later on. While they called Rubber Soul the pot album, I think Revolver is definitely the acid album. The second observation is the studio trickery used by the Beatles. Every song I talked about on this album was really carefully crafted one way or another, which led to a lot of creative results in the end, from amazing melodies to some incredible musicianship. The biggest reason in the quality of this album to me was because of the experimentation, and without it, I think many of the songs on this album would have really lost their charm. I mean, could you imagine songs like She Said, Tomorrow Never Knows, I'm Only Sleeping, Rain, and so on, being as good as they are without the studio experimentation? The use of studio on this album really made the album sessions enjoyable for all of them, and this is actually the most balanced album from a creative side of things, as really they would ever do. I mean, George, John, Paul, and Ringo all had an equal amount of input, which definitely started to decrease after this album. The studio experimentation largely impacted that though. The last observation is the fact that the Beatles started their studio-only phase in this album. Of the 16 songs I talked about, only Paperback Writer was ever played live during their tenure. It's amazing how the Beatles were playing songs live they really no longer believed in from a creative side of things. I mean, they played songs like She's a Woman and I Feel Fine live only months after recording a song like Tomorrow Never Knows. That had to feel a bit off for them, and sure enough, their US tour in the summer would be the last tour they would ever do. I'll definitely be talking more about this in a separate video, but the songs the Beatles were now interested in creating really surpassed anything they could create live. I mean, they were no longer just a rock and roll band, they suddenly became icons of a musical revolution. And sadly, the songs that were breaking boundaries and barriers just couldn't be recreated live during their tenure. Honestly though, an album like Revolver is probably best suited for a recording anyways. I mean, any variation of Tomorrow Never Knows live probably wouldn't capture the magic of the recording itself, so the Beatles really knew that being a studio-only band was really the only way it would work now. In the end though, Revolver is really an album that gets glossed over because it's sandwiched between an album considered a turning point of their career and an album considered their greatest. To me though, this album is as much of a turning point as Rubber Soul is personally. I mean, not only do the songs become more unconventional here, but the songs just all represent who the Beatles were really becoming personally at this point in their careers. To them, it was no longer about playing rock and roll and getting to the top. What they craved now was reaching new heights with their music, and I think Revolver really represents the furthest point that pop music ever reached on an album. Some of the songs on this album, after hundreds of listens, still changed the way I think of pop music, and really, they made me a music fan altogether. Not to mention the fact that many artists cite this album as the pinnacle of pop music itself. I mean, Elvis Costello said something really interesting actually regarding this album, and the statement he made couldn't be any more true.
People are still trying to make that record today, 30 years later.
even to this day, there aren't really any albums that have the magic of Revolver. Now don't get me wrong, there's still tons of good music being made and tons of great albums as well. But with this album specifically, there's no massive change of quality or massive change of style that this album really encompasses. It's really a one-of-a-kind album that takes music and makes it into an art form. It may not get as much attention compared to albums like Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road, but Revolver has changed a ton of musicians' mindset on what music can be, really. On my DeviantArt, I call this the greatest album ever made, and I stand by that. It's so bold, brave, experimental, and confident. But the question is, as we head into the studio years of the Beatles, is this really the greatest Beatles album? The first test will come in the name of Sgt. Pepper, an album so groundbreaking and innovative that it changed the scene of music forever. Join me next time when I talk about the album considered by nearly everyone to be the greatest, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.